She tried to quit, but he already knew she was carrying his baby. And that's when this story goes completely insane. He's not just her cold billionaire boss, he's a mafia kingpin who ignores her after one night, then suddenly blocks her exit with 4 terrifying words: "This baby is mine." But wait, it gets worse. Her own brother's debt drags her into a kidnapping plot, and just when it looks like he saves her like a hero, the final twist suggests he may have been part of the trap all along.
Trust me when I tell you this. I concealed everything. That night, the feelings, the child. I thought I could simply vanish, leaving no trace. But when I turned to leave his world behind, his gaze held me captive, too near, too predatory, as he spoke in a low murmur, the choice already made for me. Whether you like it or not, you are staying. After a pause, his eyes bore into mine. This baby is mine. It was then I understood I never held the reins to this story. My name is Alessia, and our tale is just beginning. Belle. Chapter 1. The Caution She Ignored. It was a morning that felt engineered for good fortune. A perfect sky, and excellent coffee from the very first sip. The beige blazer fit perfectly. The contract had been inked the day before, doubled the salary. The role I had coveted for 2 years. My office, just a 20-minute commute. I walked out to the street, portfolio secured in my bag, feeling as though every piece of my life was falling into its rightful place. My first call was for Lorenzo. It was always for Lorenzo ever since we were 12, sharing a flat too small for 2 kids with far too much spirit. I knew his was the first voice I needed to hear when anything of consequence happened. Good or bad, urgent or not, he came first, the rest of the world second. Some childhood rituals you never let go, and that particular one never struck me as an issue. He answered after 2 rings, as he always does when it's me. I got the position, I said, dispensing with the formalities we never required. Signed yesterday, Viscari Holdings. A silence followed, lasting 3 full seconds. I counted them instinctively, the reflex of someone who knows her brother's every nuance, who can discern a pause of joy from one of sheer tension. This was the latter. Viscari, he repeated, and the name sounded alien on his tongue. Viscari Holdings. Yes, I affirmed, and my own voice was already tinged with something new, a premonition of danger that surfaced before I consciously felt it. You know of them? I know the owner, and that is when I heard his serious tone. One Lorenzo reserves for rare occasions, always with cause, his most maddening trait as an older brother. There was no alarm, no drama, just the steady, low voice of a man about to deliver news he'd rather not, but would, because that was his way with me. Talk, I commanded, and so he talked. Not about everything, I realize now, months later, with the grim wisdom of one who endured her own pride. Lorenzo held back parts of the tale, for reasons that would only make sense to me much later. He told me just what he thought I could handle without bolting from the job. But it was enough. Dante Viscari, 35 years old, lord of an empire that dwarfed his title of CEO. His was a power not recorded in contracts, but in whispered conversations and problems that dissolved before they ever materialized. One of the most revered figures in the Mafia, a womanizer by nature, not one to collect names, but one who curated moments, never sharing his bed with any woman for more than a single night. Alessia, Lorenzo said, and I knew that tone as well. It was the sound of him weighing each syllable, arranging his words to pierce through my defenses. This man is going to see you. Men of his kind always do. I laughed. It wasn't a mocking sound. It was the reflexive laugh of a younger sister who'd spent 15 years watching her brother escalate simple matters into catastrophes. and had learned to gauge his alarms against his history. Lorenzo's history included forbidding me to bike on the street at 13 and being certain I would get lost taking the subway alone at 18. The man has a singular genius for inflating danger. Lorenzo, I said, with a patience I reserved only for him, I am an executive assistant. I will be managing schedules and writing reports. You will be walking into his office each day, he answered, his voice level, his rhythm unchanged, which was infinitely more disturbing than if he had yelled. I am going to do my job, I said. There is a distinction. For you, there is. For him, maybe not. I fell quiet for a moment. It wasn't because he had persuaded me, but because the quiet certainty in his voice touched a nerve I did not want to acknowledge. Lorenzo wasn't being dramatic. He was being exact, and when I focused, I could tell the difference. You're making me afraid of a man I haven't even laid eyes on, I said. I'm preparing you, he returned. And then after a pause, just long enough for me to feel the weight of his next words. He doesn't seduce like a normal man, I'll lie. He needs no charming lines. He uses his presence, his proximity, the passage of time. You'll feel his effect on you before you can name why, and by the time you understand, it will be far too late to pretend you haven't. I wanted to dismiss it as an exaggeration, to insist that I was a grown woman who could handle herself, that I had navigated situations far trickier than a boss with a reputation. And I said as much, with the conviction of someone who truly believed her own words. It's not about interest, Lorenzo cut in before I was done. It is about how he functions. You could be entirely uninterested and still be affected. They are separate things. The silence between us stretched. The sun had risen higher as we spoke, the street below growing louder, and I found my grip on the phone was tighter than it needed to be. Promise me you will call if you feel anything strange, he asked. His voice held that deep current that is purely fraternal, a shield of protection with no judgment attached. I drew in a long breath and replied with the honest belief of someone speaking their present truth. I promise I won't feel anything at all. I meant it when I said it, without a hint of irony or arrogance, without the sliver of doubt that should have been there, the doubt I might have recognized if I had listened to my brother with a little less pride and a bit more focus. I then called Sophia, who squealed with delight and instantly made it a cause for celebration. I said nothing of Lorenzo. I put his warning in that mental box I use for things too complex to deal with and continued on my way, filled with the simple hope of a new chapter opening. I was not mistaken about the door. I was simply catastrophically wrong about what was waiting in the other side. 10 floors up and 20 minutes away, Dante Viscari was looking at my file. It was standard practice for anyone with access to his private calendar. I learned much later that he never finished it, closing it halfway through before pushing it aside. He then sat in silence, staring out his window. Marco later said it was the only time in years he was unable to guess what his boss was thinking. Chapter 2. The Meeting. The Vicari Holdings Tower was a structure of glass and dark steel, all sharp angles, the sort of architecture that quietly declares its own supremacy. The receptionist confirmed my name, prepared my temporary badge, and paused for a heartbeat before passing it to me. Good luck, she murmured. Just that, with a polite smile that never touched her eyes, the kind that is technically pleasant but utterly devoid of warmth. I clipped the badge to my blazer and walked to the elevator, a feeling growing that her 2 words meant more than I was willing to consider. The 10th floor was silent. Not empty, but filled with the profound quiet of a place where everyone has learned to speak in low tones. Assistants in the corridor sized me up with candid expressions, clearly wondering how long I'd managed to last. I knocked on his office door, stepped inside, and stopped cold. Dante Viscari did not look up from his work as I came in. He remained still, pen poised over the paper, his complete awareness of my presence a palpable thing. He knew I was there. The stillness was not inattention, it was a tactic. He was making me feel the sheer power of the room before he would even acknowledge me in it. I waited by the door, counting 45 seconds of suppressed rage, aware of his strategy and refusing to let it show. It was long enough to smell the wood and leather, long enough to grasp that his authority needed no words. Then he raised his head. It was a slow, deliberate motion, imbued with the calm of a man who never needs to hurry. His eyes found me and locked on. This was not the quick appraisal of a boss meeting a new hire, but the lingering, steady gaze of a man who has found something of great interest and has all the time in the world to study it. Something inside me stirred. A rapid, involuntary impulse that predated any conscious thought, the kind of reaction you have before you can decide against it. Lorenzo's voice echoed in that very instant. He is going to see you. Men of his kind always do. I straightened my spine. I resolved then and there that this man would never glimpse the turmoil his stare ignited within me. I would be professional, efficient, and untouchable. I would maintain that front by any means necessary. Romano, he said. His voice was low and direct, each syllable landing with a precision I hadn't anticipated. Yes, I answered. Sit. It was not an invitation. It was an order. It was a command, not a request. The distinction wasn't verbal. It was in the air, in his posture, in the unwavering gaze that held mine as he spoke. I took my seat, opened my laptop, arranged the folder, and uncapped my pen. The practice motions of any routine meeting. Then I met his eyes, a professional necessity, a refusal to concede that anything in that room could force me to look away. He watched me with a stillness that began to stir an unidentifiable irritation deep within me. You've reviewed the job description, he stated. That was a statement, not an inquiry. I have, I replied, and I've prepared a priority summary for the first week. If you'd like to see it. I trailed off. Something flickered in his eyes, too quick to decipher, but it was there. Unnecessary, he cut in. I am aware of the priorities. He then turned back to his papers, the discussion concluded by his silent decree. I held his gaze for a single measured half-second, my only permitted act of defiance, then opened my laptop and began my work. The battle lines had been drawn, and the true insult was his apparent ignorance of the conflict. Or worse, his knowing dismissal of me as a worthy opponent. The morning passed as I acclimated to the office's cadence. At 11, he summoned me by name, his eyes fixed on his desk, but the document was in my hand before he could finish. He scanned it, his pause lasting just a beat too long. Correct. Yet I caught it, that fleeting moment his gaze settled on me before returning to the page, an intensity that was anything but professional. He wasn't hiding it, merely not advertising it. An unsettling clarity washed over me. Lorenzo had not been embellishing. This man saw me, and the truth I wouldn't confront until hours later, walking home through the city's clamor with my laptop tucked under my arm, was that I had seen him too, in a way that could never be undone. Chapter 3. The Forbidden Connection. Our first 2 months unfolded as a quiet war. a conflict that began before I even knew I was a combatant. It started with that first glance, that first command, and the clandestine meetings that never graced a calendar. Last-minute summons behind closed doors with unbadged men who vanished like ghosts. Through these fragments, the fiction of Dante Viscari as a mere CEO dissolved. A name surfaced in these discussions, Srokin, never uttered in my presence but captured on a document that landed on my desk in error. I read it before handing it back. I had no idea who he was. But the way Marco snatched the paper from my grasp, swift, silent, his eyes conveying both an order and a plea, told me all I needed to know. This was a name best left in the shadows. For my own part, I set my own terms, the only ones that truly counted: professional, capable, impenetrable. This became essential once I understood the office concealed far more than mere business dealings. Amid the unrecorded meetings, the unspoken names, and the silences heavy with meaning, I built my fortress of competence. I submitted work ahead of schedule, preempted his requests, and handled issues others deferred. It was an efficiency I wielded for myself, not for his approval, a crucial distinction known only to me. His demands were legitimate, his standards unforgiving and unapologetic. His objectivity was direct, almost brutal, the mark of a man acquainted with consequences most could never comprehend. If my work fell short, he said so. And when I surpassed his expectations, his silence spoke volumes. He noticed. I could feel that he noticed. Had he been merely demanding or simply cold, I could have adapted. The true complication was his attention, the way he assessed everything and everyone, not with impulse, but with unnerving calculation. He never reacted, he only decided, and he observed me with the same sharp focus I used to study him, making it impossible to categorize him as just another superior. The small things began to gather near the end of that first month. So subtly I was ensnared before I could feign ignorance. It started with the coffee. I had a ritual. A small cup, black, no sugar, picked up before I ever stepped into the office. Then, one Monday, I entered the break room to find a cup waiting for me. My name was on a note affixed to the side, written in a script as direct and unadorned as his speech. I must have stood there staring for 3 full seconds because Carla from finance glided past me and murmured without a backward glance, "Welcome to the club." I didn't ask her to explain. I simply took the coffee, went to my desk, and said nothing. He, in turn, said nothing. Yet every morning thereafter, the coffee was there, prepared exactly as I liked it, an unspoken, unrequested ritual. It was a minor thing, of course, but the danger of minor things is how they build upon one another. The second detail arrived in the form of a green dress. I wore it sparingly, my armor for days that demanded inner fortitude. It defined my waist with an understated elegance, falling to my hips in a line that commanded notice without ever asking for it. I chose it one Thursday in our second month for a critical presentation needing to feel anchored and present. Dante canceled the 11 o'clock meeting without explanation. He remained in the office the entire day. And throughout that day, the nature of his gaze shifted. It wasn't more overt or more constant, but it carried a new gravity, as if an unseen dial had been turned up a single, imperceptible notch. It was in his gaze, which held mine for a fraction of a second too long. It was in the infinitesimal hesitation after he spoke my surname and before he gave a command, a pause that served no practical purpose. It was in the very air between us when I approached his desk, a space that felt charged, heavier than anywhere else in that office. I avoided the green dress the next week. It took me 2 more to confess to myself why. The third detail shattered what little rational defense I had left. At the end of that second month, a dinner was held with a partner firm's executives. I was there to manage the event, to be functionally invisible, as is the art of the executive assistant. The evening proceeded smoothly until an executive, a man around 50 and several drinks past discretion, made a remark as I stepped away. I never heard his words, but I understood their nature by the aftermath. The following morning, Dante severed all ties with the man's company. The official record, dutifully typed by Marco, cited long-term strategic divergences, a piece of corporate fiction we all silently accepted. And Marco Vitali, who had observed us since the very beginning like a chronicler awaiting the story's climax, actually smiled. It was the first I had seen in months, a fleeting, knowing smirk. He neither concealed nor flaunted it. He simply allowed it to be, which, from Marco, was a full dissertation. I learned of the canceled contract from a misdirected email. For a long while, I just stared at the screen, a new feeling taking root inside me, something uninvited and impossible to manage. It was a fusion of warmth and dread, a blend I could not parse. That evening, I called Lorenzo. I told him work was fine, the boss was tough, and everything was as expected. "Are you all right?" he asked, as he always did. "I'm fine," I lied. The truth was reserved for Sophia. It always was. Because Sophia offers no judgment, no panic, and never ever says, "I told you so." Sophia listens, she analyzes, and she speaks her mind with a brutal honesty that can sting, but is always true. In the third month, the quiet war began to thaw. Nothing was declared, but the very air in that office had shifted. It was an awareness that hung in the silence after everyone else had gone home, a charge in the corridor when he walked by, a weight in the pauses between his words. It was a constant, unnerving sense of his location in any room. It was an instinct that told me when he was rising from his seat, when he was drawing near, when he was lingering beside my desk for a moment that defied professional necessity. It was the way he said my last name, Romano, a simple surname from anyone else, but not from him. Yet his voice carried a tone she had begun to recognize as something other than a summons. As if her name was a threshold he intentionally crossed, pronouncing it with the slow calm of a man who knows he will arrive at his destination. She chose to ignore it. It was the only defense she possessed. Then came the afternoon of a perfectly average Wednesday, until it wasn't. She was over the conference table arranging papers for the next day's meeting. The workday was ending. The room had slowly emptied, leaving behind that distinct silence a space holds when the bodies are gone, but their tension lingers. The light had dimmed, the halls were hushed, and her mind was on the flawed chronology of a report, an irritation just sharp enough to keep her from noticing anything else. Then she heard Dante's office door swing open. She heard the footsteps, and she knew them now. Their cadence, the specific weight they pressed into the wooden floor, their unvarying speed, except for when it changed. Her mind had catalogued these details for weeks without her consent, and she had ceased resisting the fact, for the resistance was futile. The steps moved toward the bookshelf behind her, behind the table where she worked. The room was vast. There were countless paths he could have taken. He passed directly behind her, and in a moment she can still replay with a detail that haunts her. His hand grazed her back. The lightest touch, fingertips against the curve of her hip for less than 2 seconds, a brush that might pass for an accident if it were not for the awareness held within it. If his pace had not slowed by a single precise degree at that very instant, only to resume its rhythm right after. It was no accident. They were both certain of it. She rose slowly, documents in hand, as the heat of his touch bloomed through her, an intruder that asks no permission and does not leave when it is told. He was already across the room, his back turned as he opened a folder, projecting the absolute tranquility of a man who had done nothing. His shoulders were broad, his movements exact, betraying nothing. The quiet between them now had a different weight than any silence that had come before. She finished her work with the measured gestures of someone who fears that one stray movement might admit a truth she was not yet ready to face. She gathered her things, took her bag, and walked out without a backward glance, knowing it was the one thing she could not allow herself to do. That touch lingered for hours, a phantom heat she carried to the restaurant where she met Sophia and told her she hadn't meant to. The confession escaped before the thought, the way the most important truths often do with the right person. "He touched me," she said. Sophia set her glass down. "How?" "On my back, as he walked by." Alicia lifted her own glass of wine with deliberate care. "Alicia," her friend began, in that tone reserved for an obvious truth the other person is refusing to see. "A man like that does nothing by accident." She knew. She had known the instant it occurred, with the infuriating clarity of a revelation that arrives at the worst possible moment. But hearing Sophia voice it made the act real in a way she had fought for hours to deny. "And then," Sophia prompted. "And then nothing," she replied. "He's my boss." Sophia studied her for a long time, her expression that of someone with 1,000 things to say, deciding where to begin. "For now," she said, then ordered more wine. Chapter 4. The Dangerous Seduction. By the 5th month, Dante's pretense of professionalism began to fray. Not overtly, not in any way she could document or capture in an objective statement, but in a manner she felt on her skin. She had spent too long deciphering the silences of this specific man and could no longer feign ignorance. It began in the elevator. They entered together on a Thursday after a meeting had run late, leaving the office with the charged energy of a conclusion. Just the two of them. He pressed the button for the ground floor, the doors slid shut, and the elevator's small confines seemed to shrink. She stood, her gaze fixed on the doors. He stood behind her. His scent reached her first. Wood, amber, and a deeper note she could not name, but that her mind had registered weeks ago and filed away with an unauthorized focus. She stared at the doors, using her concentration like a shield, and she knew, in that honest part of herself, that the shield was about to shatter. With 3 floors left, he shifted closer by 1 centimeter, just 1. But in that small space, that dense quiet, 1 centimeter was the line between a manageable distance and a world of new territory. "You wear this dress on purpose," he said. His voice was so low she felt its vibration on her neck before the words reached her ears. It was not a question. It was a declaration, spoken with the calm of a man who is simply stating a conclusion he has already reached. She did not turn. Facing the doors, she answered in the most neutral tone she could muster. "I wear what I want." "I know," he replied, pausing for a single beat before adding, "That's what bothers me." The doors opened. She stepped out with the purposeful stride of someone certain of their destination. And only after she rounded the corner, out of his line of sight, Did she finally release the breath she had been holding since the third floor? He waited 2 full seconds before exiting the elevator himself. She did not see this, but she knew. In the same way she could always locate him in a room, she knew when he was still, and she knew what those 2 seconds meant. The trip to Milan was set for 2 weeks later, a schedule packed with meetings with their Italian counterparts, a logistical plan she had arranged with her usual care, and separate suites on the same hotel floor. She noted this fact with a surge of relief, and then felt a flash of irritation at her own relief, for it implied she had considered the alternative, and that was a path she had forbidden her mind to take. The first day was grueling and technical. During one session, she spotted a critical flaw in an executive's projection before anyone else, and she spoke up. A hush fell over the room. Dante turned his head toward her. He did not smile, but a look in his eyes registered something she stored away without meaning to. That evening, she was in the hotel bar, her laptop open, with the genuine aim of working for another 2 hours. She wore a simple dress, her hair was down, and she had a glass of wine as a small reward. Then he was there. He sat beside her, not across from her. His arm was centimeters from hers, his presence a warmth that arrived before his words, as it always did. "The work is done," he said. "I know," she replied, and closed the laptop. She closed it without a fight, without question, with a lack of resistance that startled her. She chose not to analyze it because analysis would make her leave, and she wanted to stay. That was the inconvenient truth. For an hour and a half, they remained in that bar. He said little, but his words were real, with a substance that never existed in meetings. He mentioned his childhood in Milan, a brief, almost accidental confession, like a word that slips out before it can be stopped. She absorbed every detail with an attention she had long tried to suppress, but which was on high alert that night. As she prepared to leave, his hand came to rest on hers. It was a slow, intentional act with no disguise. She looked at his hand, at the fingers that covered her own with a quiet firmness that was not pressure but weight, the kind of weight that comes not from force but from pure intention. And she did not pull her hand away. "You're different," he said. It was a statement of fact, devoid of romance or any calculated charm, just a direct sentence, as if he were communicating a verified truth. "You say that to all of them," she countered, her eyes still on his hand. "I don't say anything to all of them," he answered. And she believed him, instantly, without hesitation or a need for proof, with that primal certainty that comes when the body recognizes a truth before the mind can even begin to process it. She believed him, and that realization was precisely what terrified her. She returned to her room, her heart beating a rhythm she refused to analyze. She called Sophia, whose shriek of excitement made her pull the phone from her ear. Her friend told her she deserved one night. Just one. It didn't have to mean anything. Tomorrow she would be the impeccable assistant once more, but that night could be hers if she chose it. She hung up and stared at the ceiling for 40 minutes. The next day, they both arrived at the meetings, perfectly composed, and they spent the day behaving as if the night before never happened. But they both knew it had, and this shared, unspoken knowledge had forever changed the quality of every silence between them. Late that day, with meetings concluded, he swept past the doorway where I was sorting files. His words were a command flung over his shoulder. "Dinner, 8 o'clock, a key client, be there." I went. It was a business matter, I told myself. The establishment was a small, subdued secret. The kind of unlisted place where the food seems to know your hunger and the sommelier knows the proprietor's name. I was punctual, arriving at 8. He was there alone. The client, I asked, my eyes scanning the room. Dante's gaze was an unreadable mask that somehow confessed everything. Cancelled last minute. I froze, my attention fixed on him, on the table arranged for 2, at the glass of wine that already awaited me. This was deliberate, I stated. He just inclined his head, an answer more potent than words. You could have told me, I said, and you would not have come, he replied. True, I sat down. The evening became a real conversation, easy and without pretense, no laptops present. It was the seamless continuation of what had begun at the bar the night before. He ordered the wine without viewing the menu, already knowing what I would desire. A dry comment he made about the Milan executive drew a laugh from me, and he watched me with an expression I could not name, but it settled inside me, dense and still, the way all meaningful things do. Midway through dinner, his hand drifted to my face, unhurried, his thumb brushing my cheek with a touch so faint I nearly convinced myself I'd dreamt it. But the heat it left was more real than anything I had known in a very long time. You have a smile, he murmured with that low voice he reserved for things meant to be felt, not just heard, that you conceal at work. I offered no reply. I couldn't. I still think about it. His hand then descended my neck, his fingertips tracing a deliberate, slow path to my shoulder. From day one, the warmth of his hand through the fabric of my dress was a tangible thing, impossible to disregard. I used every shred of my concentration to keep my face from betraying me, though some part of me was certain he was reading me anyway. Dante, I said. My voice emerged differently than I had intended, lower, less certain. He responded, his hand unmoving, not retreating a single millimeter. You are doing this on purpose. Yes, he said, without a trace of hesitation. I am. The sheer honesty of it disarmed me. This was not some sort of game. This was a man who was done pretending. He withdrew his hand slowly, and I used the rest of dinner to try and find a normal rhythm for breathing. In the car to the hotel, the silence between us possessed an entirely new quality, charged and aware. We both knew the destination of this path, and neither of us feigned ignorance. And in that silent honesty, there was an intimacy I never expected from the night. When the car stopped at the hotel's entrance, he remained still. I looked at him. He looked back at me, and the control he always wielded, that precise, unbreakable wall, was slightly ajar, like a door cracked open in the dark. I could perceive what was on the other side. And what was there was not the cold boss or the calculating mafioso. It was just the man. I opened my door. He followed me to his room. As I was about to bid him good night and flee with my remaining sense, his hand closed on my wrist. He turned me to face him and kissed me. It was not gentle. It was deep and precise and filled with everything that had been restrained for the last 5 months. It was in the touches that halted midway, in the gazes that lingered a moment too long, in the silences that held more weight than silence should bear. His mouth on mine felt like something finally reaching its proper place. My balance vanished in an instant. My hands found his suit out of pure instinct to keep from falling, and he deepened the kiss, his hand on my face, his thumb on my jaw, holding me with a firmness that spoke of no hurry. But there was no longer any space left between us. When he opened the door to the room and drew me in, I went. The room was larger, darker, with the whole of Milan spread out below the panoramic window. I paused before the glass. He shut the door. Our reflections in the window, him approaching me slowly, his eyes in the reflection meeting mine before his hand rested on my waist from behind, created an image I knew I would carry forever. Alesia, the first time he used my name, not Romano. Alesia, spoken with a cadence I had never heard applied to myself. His mouth was close to my temple, the warmth of his voice a touch of its own. If you want to leave. I don't want to leave, I said. And that was the last logical choice I made that night. What I know is that the Dante Viscari in that Milan room was not the detached boss or the man in a tailored suit who could intimidate without raising his voice. He was the man who looked at me as if he had finally discovered something he hadn't realized he was searching for, and who touched with the careful attention he gave to every detail, slowly, with the same precision he applied to everything. But that night held a completely different warmth, and that was more dangerous than anything he had done before. Chapter 5. The morning after. It took me several days to truly process what occurred. Not the night in Milan. That part I understood with an almost irritatingly perfect clarity. The real challenge was understanding the chain of events that followed, seeing how every link fit a pattern that, in retrospect, was always there to see. I came to before he did. Milan was still cloaked in night, buildings reduced to glittering specks beyond the window. I lay there quietly, feeling the serene gravity of our actions. Dante was on his side, his arms stretched into the warmth I'd left behind. So much less armor, so much more man. I rose without a sound, retrieved my dress from the floor, and slipped into the bathroom. When I returned, he was already awake, leaning on an elbow, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that sleep had not dimmed. "Running away," he observed. His voice was a low, morning rough rasp, deeper than usual, and held a gentle humor I hadn't anticipated in that instant. "I have to get organized," I replied. "My flight's at 3 o'clock. "I'm aware of the flight time," he said. "It's 8 in the morning. He then rose, moved toward me, and kissed me with the unhurried calm of a man who feels no need to rush. With one hand cupping my face and the other at my waist, the kiss lingered, dismantling every rational thought I had about distance, sensibility, and resuming my role as his flawless assistant. Later, at a bistro from his youth, Dante revealed a side of himself I'd never witnessed, an openness that had no place in boardrooms or business directives. He inquired about me, not about the work. When I mentioned something about the previous day's meeting, he laughed. A small, genuine laugh, the kind I had witnessed maybe 2 times in 5 months, and it did something inconvenient inside me every time. At the airport and on the plane, we worked next to each other, his arm brushing mine on the armrest. It was deliberate enough to not be an accident, but casual enough that it required no comment. When the car stopped at my apartment, he got out with me. He waited on the sidewalk as I opened the gate. And when I turned to say goodnight, he was too close for the words to suffice. He kissed me again, briefer this time, quieter, his hand on my cheek for a second before he released me. Then he stepped away and said with that low voice I had now charted in every conceivable register, "See you tomorrow, Romano." And he departed. I entered my apartment, my coat still in my hand, and stood in the hall for a moment for no clear reason, feeling something I could not name, but it was warm and real, and I would carry it with me to sleep that night with a lightness I had not known in a long time. I did not yet realize that "see you tomorrow" was the last version of that man I would see for a very long time. The next morning, I arrived at the office at my usual time. Dante was in his office in a dark suit, coffee in hand, documents open on the desk, his posture closed, his expression neutral, his eyes on the paper, everything exactly as it was on the first day. As if the 5 months of tension, as if Milan, as if the sidewalk in front of my apartment the night before had simply never happened. He glanced up when I came in, looking at me for a second with the quick, evaluating gaze of a boss assessing an employee, devoid of any of the layers that look had held in recent weeks. "Romano, last week's report contains an error in the third quarter projection. Just that, no different pause, no different intonation. Nothing to suggest there was anything different between us beyond the professional dynamic that had existed from day one." I stood at the door for 2 seconds. 2 seconds that were the longest I can recall living in an office hallway, with that distinct sensation of the ground being slowly and silently pulled out from under you. I stepped inside, sat down, and opened my laptop. "I'll have it corrected by 11 o'clock. "By 10, he commanded, his eyes already returning to the papers. And that was all. My day unfolded on autopilot, that version of me that executes with precision while the rest of my mind grapples with something it cannot yet name. I revised the report, managed the schedule, and replied to every email with my typical efficiency. When I departed at 7 that night, he never once glanced up from his desk. In the restaurant bathroom where I met Sophia, I stood before the mirror for 5 minutes with the kind of stare you use when checking if you are still intact and you remain unconvinced by the answer. "I'm just another conquest to him," I said, finally sitting across from her. "Alasia," she started, clearing her throat. "No," I cut in, my grip on the glass firm, closing the topic before it could fester. "It was one night, it's finished, I am moving on." Sophia watched me with that look of hers, the one filled with unspoken words, weighing if now was the time. She decided against it. She refilled her glass and stayed with me until midnight, never uttering his name again. Which is how Sophia shows her love. I moved on, or I attempted to. A coldness took hold, not by design, but as a natural act of self-preservation. It is what happens when you deny yourself the luxury of an uninvited emotion, remaining professional at the purest level. No conversations went beyond what was necessary, no lingering seconds, none of the subtle attention I'd learned to give without realizing it. Dante registered the change. I could see it when he would pause mid-sentence, studying me for a moment before continuing. His expression shuddered in a way I now refuse to decipher. I mistook it for indifference. I was mistaken. What I was yet to learn was that the night hadn't been just a single night for him either, that he had stared at his ceiling, unable to find the words for his feelings, and did what men like him always do. He erected a barrier. While we both waited, something inside me was shifting, making it almost impossible to pretend that nothing had happened. Chapter 6. Lorenzo finds out the sickness began in the 6th week following Milan. I told myself it was stress, which was real and abundant, a convenient excuse for any strange thing my body decided to do. I blamed it on the new brand of coffee I was drinking. I blamed it on the punishing work pace that had intensified with the new project, keeping me at the office later than usual. I had a full roster of explanations, and I cycled through them for days. The nausea persisted. On a Tuesday, I purchased the test from a pharmacy 2 blocks away from my office and used it in the bathroom on my lunch break. I sat there in the stall, pointlessly holding toilet paper, while 2 minutes crawled by with the weight of an imminent, landscape-altering change. 2 lines. I did not panic. Alicia Romano does not panic. This was one of the few truths about myself I held on to with absolute certainty, and it remained solid in that corporate bathroom stall. I gazed at the 2 lines, my thoughts struggling to catch up with what my eyes had already confirmed. Then I folded the device, placed it in my purse, washed my hands, and met my own gaze in the mirror. The woman reflected back looked unchanged. A tailored blazer, an upright posture, a controlled expression. But there was something in her eyes I knew was the start of a tempest that had yet to surface, but that would arrive sooner or later. No matter how hard I fought to contain it, I slung my bag over my shoulder, thinking with the cold resolve of a survivor. I have to leave. Lorenzo appeared at my apartment on Thursday night unannounced, as he has since we were children, holding a plastic container with the ease of someone bringing food from home, knowing without asking that I hadn't cooked in days. Heated it in my microwave, he announced, striding past me into the living room as if the apartment were also his, which it has always sort of been. You don't eat when you're worried. I was on the sofa, laptop on my legs. I looked up, said I was fine, that he shouldn't worry, that I'd eaten lunch. The 3 standard lies in their standard order with their standard tone. Lorenzo just stared at me for 30 seconds without a word. I know my brother in every conceivable way, and he knows me just as well. 30 years of shared existence creates a language beyond words, one that lives in silences and gestures, and in how one holds a plastic container while looking at you. What I read in his eyes in those 30 seconds was the clear understanding that something was wrong. He was just waiting for me to be ready to say it. "What is it?" he asked. "It's nothing, Alicia. I am fine, Lorenzo." He placed the container on the coffee table, sat beside me, and gently took the laptop from my lap. He didn't grab it or force it, just lifted it away with the quiet motion of someone making room for a talk that is bound to happen, and who would rather it happen without barriers between them. He remained silent. It was the silence of a brother who would not be leaving. I resisted as long as I could, which is never very long with him. I told him I didn't organize my thoughts. I didn't select my words with care. The story spilled out in the same sequence it existed within me, the sequence in which it had occurred. The night in Milan, the coffee at the airport the next morning, the kiss on the curb, the office the following day, and the report with the error in the 3rd quarter. The months of his silence that I had read as apathy and still didn't know how to see differently. And then the bathroom on Tuesday, the 2 lines. When I was done, Lorenzo became intensely still. It's a stillness I know well. It is not calm, it is restraint. It is the Lorenzo who is feeling far more than he shows, holding back his impulse to act so he can hear what I still need to voice. It's a discipline he has honed over years of protecting me without suffocating me, a difficult balance he doesn't always achieve, but he was achieving it that night. He rose, walked to the window, and stood with his back to me, his shoulders tight, gazing at the street below for a long time. "I warned you," he said. 2 words, devoid of accusation. I needed that to be clear for my own sake and anyone else's. There was no, "I told you so. Why didn't you listen? Look what you've done." There was only the quiet agony of someone who was right and wished he hadn't been, spoken low, with his back turned and his shoulders bearing a weight I did not yet fully understand. "I know," I replied. "This man," he began, "Lorenzo." My voice was firm, the kind of firm that emerges when I need to be seen in one way and not another. "I made a choice, too. Don't you dare treat me like a victim." He turned, his gaze a complex storm of anger, pain, and something else buried deep that I could not yet identify, a guilt that seemed to spring from a place I could not yet reach, something he carried for reasons unknown to me and which he was not prepared to share that night. He returned to the couch, draping his arm over my shoulders with the familiar weight of a Lorenzo hug, the kind he gives when he has no words, which is a rarity. The absence of his words in that moment spoke volumes. We sat that way for a time. My head rested slightly on him. His arm was a firm presence, while the city hummed outside as if our world wasn't tilting on its axis the way the universe always does when a life is about to change forever. "What are you going to do?" he asked at last. His voice was different now, softer, more cautious, the voice of a brother genuinely asking, not arriving with a prepackaged answer. "I'm still thinking," I told him. He nodded, then fell silent again. "Are you going to tell him?" he asked. "No," I said without a moment's hesitation, because the answer had been there, clear and cold, since that Tuesday in the bathroom. Lorenzo pressed his lips into a thin line. He didn't argue, yet. I know my brother, and the yet was the key. He was tabling his dissent for a more appropriate time, his way of respecting my needs now, without forfeiting what he would need to say later. We remained on the couch for 2 more hours. He opened the container of food, placed a fork in my hand with the gentle command of someone not taking no for an answer, and we sat in a comfortable quiet, the silence of siblings who don't need to fill every space with noise once the important things have been spoken. As he was leaving, he held me at the door, the hug lasting longer and feeling tighter than usual. And a part of me, the part that always registers the things that should be warnings, knew that his embrace felt like a farewell, not a final one, but the kind someone gives before they do something they know you will not approve of. I shut the door and stood alone in the hall. That night, I was blind to the coming storm. The truth would find me, but only after the damage was already done. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. My brother went to do the one thing I never could, and Dante Viscari was about to hear a truth no one else dared to speak. I was unaware that Lorenzo had gone, lost in my apartment with a laptop glowing, a resignation letter on the screen. I was rereading the same line for the 4th time, deleting and rewriting, because some words must be perfect. Meanwhile, my brother was crossing the city, walking into the Viscari Holdings tower without an appointment, without permission. I would learn everything later, in pieces, first from Marco's account, shared weeks after with the clipped brevity of a man who only tells you what is absolutely essential. And then I heard it from Lorenzo himself, relayed with the blunt honesty of someone who stands by their actions. No regrets. Lorenzo had approached reception, stating he had urgent personal business. He gave his name with the chilling certainty that the surname alone would open doors. It did, though, not as he'd imagined. Marco Vital, who took the call upstairs, recognized the name Romano. On a gut instinct he couldn't explain, he approved the visit. Dante saw him simply because the alternative, a scene in his pristine lobby, was unthinkable. It was a cold calculation he'd made before the elevator even reached his floor. The office was steeped in silence when Lorenzo walked in. Dante stood behind his desk, an open folder in his hands. Marco, who saw it from the doorway before being dismissed, said, the boss had risen the moment the name Romano crackled through the intercom, moving with the quiet readiness of a man bracing for a momentous conversation. Lorenzo entered the room without a hint of fear. The suit did not intimidate him, nor did the office, nor the stare that had broken countless others. He had learned long ago on the streets that another man's power is never a reason to lose your own footing. A lesson taught with an efficiency no school could ever match. "You know who I am," he said. "I do," Dante replied. His voice was low, devoid of threat, but carried the weight of a man who had no need for it. "Sit. I'd rather stand." A pause hung in the air. Dante leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. Not a defensive posture, but an observant one, giving Lorenzo the same total focus he offered anything he deemed important. Lorenzo later said he felt that attention like a physical force, but he did not move. "My sister is pregnant with your child," Lorenzo stated. The words were direct, unadorned, a fact dropped into the space between them. Dante did not answer. He remained perfectly still, and Marco, who understood his boss better than almost anyone, knew that stillness was not coldness. It was the precise opposite. It was a man fighting to contain an internal earthquake. "And you're there," Lorenzo pressed on, his voice hardening but never rising, never losing the iron control he'd brought with him, acting as if she's just another employee who will simply resign and vanish from your life. "What happens between me and Miss Romano?" Dante began. "Romano has a name," Lorenzo interrupted, not with a shout, but with a firm, immediate correction that would not be ignored. "Alessia. And she's not okay." Dante was silent. "She isn't sleeping," Lorenzo said. "She isn't eating. She is carrying this alone while you do what? Sign contracts? Gaze out your window and hope the problem simply evaporates? You don't know what you're talking about. I know more than you imagine about men like you." A short, calculated silence followed, the kind that precedes a devastating final point. "You act like everything belongs to you, the office, the choices, the people, but when it's time to take responsibility for something, you withdraw. You become the cold boss again, waiting for the world to rearrange itself around your inaction." Dante said nothing, and his silence, Lorenzo later recalled, was unlike anything he had expected. It wasn't the quiet of a man building an internal defense. It was the silence of someone truly listening, perhaps hearing this truth for the first time from a man who had nothing left to lose by speaking it. Lorenzo turned to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle, timing his final words with care. "She said it was just one night for you," he said, his face turned away, his voice now lower. "That she was just another one. A beat. If that's true, tell me now. At least then I'll know to take care of her myself without waiting for you." Lorenzo wavered there for a moment. Looking back, piecing it all together, I know he almost said more, almost spoke in the messages he'd been getting, of the debt that was spiraling beyond his control, about the name that was printed on every collection notice, a name he recognized far too late. But he choked it back. He left, carrying a weight I would only understand when the worst had already come to pass. Dante remained alone in the room. Marco entered 2 minutes later, as he always did after something critical. with the silent punctuality of a man who had spent years learning precisely when to enter a room and when to stay out. He saw his boss and said nothing. Dante was at the window, his refuge for processing the impossible. The city below, a sprawling machine that either put things in perspective or made the emptiness in the room more profound. "Get out," he said. Marco left, and for the first time in a very long time, for the first time in years, if he were being honest, Dante Viscari was alone with the truth of who he was. He was trapped with the words of a man who had nothing to lose and so spoke only the truth, leaving no room for a more comfortable narrative. You act like everything is yours, but when it's time to answer, you pull back. He thought of Elysia, of that morning in Milan when he chose the armor of the boss because he didn't know how to be the man who had shared her bed, because being that man meant admitting what had happened, and admitting that meant admitting he didn't know what to do next. And not knowing was a territory Dante Viscari had spent his life avoiding, with a discipline he had long mistaken for strength. He thought of the past months, of watching her withdraw, the Elysia who stopped lingering, whose voice grew clipped and whose gaze became direct, the distance between them a deliberate, managed thing. He had interpreted it as her decision, a boundary to be respected, the kind of wall a man who doesn't know how to ask can never learn to cross. If you wait for her to come to you, you'll wait forever. He knew that. He knew it before Lorenzo ever said a word. He knew it with the sour clarity of seeing a destructive pattern in yourself that you can no longer ignore. And still, he had remained motionless on his side of that divide, waiting for something else to be the agent of change. His suit was immaculate. His office was in perfect order. The city below carried on, indifferent. Dante stood before the window for a long time, and then, in unwitnessed silence, he made a decision. Not to go to her, not to fix anything yet, but the one that comes before all that. The decision to stop pretending that what he felt was manageable, that it was temporary, that it was something that would simply fade if ignored. It didn't disappear. It hadn't disappeared for months, and Elysia Romano was about to enter that room with a letter in her hand. He knew it with the certainty of someone who understands a person so well they can anticipate their every move. She thought she was coming to end something. She was wrong. Chapter 8. Like it or not, you're staying. I walked in to resign. He told me I was pregnant before I could even open my mouth. And then he uttered something that changed absolutely everything. The letter had been folded in my bag for 3 days, written on Friday, revised on Saturday, reread on Sunday with the cold logic of someone testing an argument. And it held up. My resignation offered 2 weeks' notice, adhering to the contract. The reason given was personal, deliberately unspecified, as I owed no one a truth I was unwilling to commit to paper. It was a flawless letter, courteous, concise, and final. I knew how to write such things. The words were not the problem. Walking through his door was. I delayed for 3 days, inventing plausible reasons, waiting for an opening in his schedule, waiting for the courage to face him without my expression betraying me. 3 days of riding to the 10th floor, the letter in my bag, only to leave with it still concealed. It was a failure of nerve I wouldn't name, though it was precisely that. On Monday I awoke, with the sharp, cold resolve of a decision that had to be acted on before it thawed. I got to the office at the usual hour, greeted Carla, and poured my coffee. It was the same perfect blend that appeared daily, a ritual I'd kept up to avoid the questions that stopping would invite. Explanations were what I feared most. I cupped the mug in the hallway, staring at his closed door and taking a final shaky breath before I went in. Dante was by the window with his back to me, his shoulders broad in a dark, impeccable suit. Something in his posture gave me pause. This wasn't the stance of a man idly gazing outside. It was the posture of a man who was waiting, who knew I was there and chose to remain turned away, exercising that same meticulous control he had over everything. "I need to speak with you," I said. He turned. He held my gaze for a silent moment. I had mapped every nuance of that direct stare, but this one had a different heat. It wasn't his look as a boss, nor the one he'd given me in Milan. It was a gaze I had never seen, and its foreignness was unsettling, for I thought I had seen them all. I retrieved the letter, holding it firmly with both hands like someone certain of her purpose, and declared, "I'm resigning." 2 weeks' notice, per our agreement. The silence that fell was heavy enough to feel. Dante didn't reach for the letter. He didn't even acknowledge it as an object between us. He just stood there, his eyes on me, and said, "Reason, personal Romano." His voice cooled instantly. It didn't raise, but it gained an undercurrent of steel that meant the formalities were over. This was something else, a reason I didn't need one. "You're pregnant." The quiet that followed that declaration lasted for 6 entire seconds. I counted them with the automatic part of my brain that takes over when the rest is too stunned to function. I didn't confirm or deny it. I just stood there, letter in hand, as those seconds passed with the finality of spoken truths. The world had just shifted irreversibly, a fact I felt with a clarity that preceded all emotion. "How do you know?" It wasn't a question, but the only sentence I could form, my voice emerging as a whisper. His lack of a response was answer enough. "Lorenzo." The name surfaced with the sickening certainty of recognizing a brother's signature on a betrayal I'd never witnessed. That hug, a goodbye that meant more than goodbye. Lorenzo had left, and I had failed to see it, too consumed by my own inner world to notice what was happening outside it. Dante crossed the room. His pace was not fast but deliberate, each step carrying a weight that was not hesitation but intent, the stride of a man who has already won before the battle begins. He stopped directly in front of me, far too close for a professional setting, too close for anything neutral. The space between us shrank until my every nerve was aware of his presence. I lifted my chin. The letter remained in my hand, the only thing in that moment I could control. "I don't want to stay here anymore," I said, my voice firm because it had to be. "You have a life. I have mine." Dante remained silent, his eyes fixed on me. Not the paper, not the letter. Me. He looked at me with an intensity I recognized as the truest version of him, the one that emerged when his rigid control slipped a fraction, revealing what lay beneath. And then he said, "Like it or not." Each word was placed with a deliberate, almost physical precision. "You're staying." I opened my mouth to protest. "This baby is mine." 4 words spoken in a low, absolute voice that was neither a threat nor a plea. It was a statement of fact, the kind of certainty that doesn't ask for confirmation because it needs none. The voice of a man who had settled the matter in his own mind and was now simply communicating reality. I stared at him, and he stared back. In his gaze was something I had never seen in any version of him I'd come to know. It wasn't the boss or the man from Milan or the cold wall he'd built after that night. It was something that existed before all of that, something deeper. It was the version of Dante Viscari that existed without armor, the man I'd glimpsed once and thought I would never see again. The letter in my hand suddenly felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because its carefully crafted words now belonged to a world that no longer existed. Heavier because I was still holding on, uncertain I could let go. "You can't just," I started. "I'm not just anything," he interrupted. Not with harshness, but with a directness I'd learned was his own form of honesty. "I'm stating what is." "What is?" I repeated, my voice cracking in a way I hadn't intended, a small, almost imperceptible fracture, the kind that shows when you've held too much, alone, for too long. "You disappeared. You looked at me like I was just another employee. And now—" "I know what I did," he said. 3 words, delivered without defense or explanation, stripped of the justifications most people use to soften a confession. Just the raw sentence, bearing the weight of a truth he had decided to face. I pressed my lips together, my throat tightening in a way I refused to let him see. "This doesn't solve anything," I said. "No," he agreed, "but it's a starting point." The space between us was dense with the history of Milan, the morning after, and the 6 months of distance neither of us had dared to cross. A distance that came at a cost I was just beginning to understand. It was all there, in that small space between my upturned chin and his unblinking eyes. The letter was still in my hand. Dante's gaze flickered to it for a single second before returning to my face. He didn't ask for it or make any gesture of pressure. He simply stood there, too close, too firm, too real, and waited with a new patience that reached me in a way his old control never could. I should leave. I knew I had to. I had the letter, an apartment 20 minutes away, and a life I had built myself that didn't need a man to sustain it. I knew all of that, even as he stood there looking at me, and still I stayed. Not because he ordered it, not because the past was erased or his months of silence had vanished. I stayed because the truth in his words, "This baby is mine," was spoken with a quiet finality that my body recognized before my mind could process it. And because for the first time in a very long time, Dante Viscari had stopped pretending. Chapter 9. The Kidnapping. They took me on an ordinary day, a day when everything hidden finally came rushing to the surface. I remained after that confrontation, telling myself for weeks it wasn't by choice, with the stubbornness of someone still arguing with their own heart. I stayed because he made leaving impossible, which was different from wanting to stay, which was different from admitting the letter I'd held for 3 days was never truly meant to be given. The tension between us shifted into a fragile, conscious balance built on what was said in that office and all that remained unspoken. A balance we both felt being tested every single day. It was a Thursday when Lorenzo appeared at the door, a shadow of his former self. That familiar, effortless grin was now a strained imitation. Dark hollows had bloomed beneath his eyes. His shirt was creased, a detail so unlike him, betraying a frantic energy he fought to conceal. But I saw it in the first 30 seconds. I knew him too well. The warning signs had been there for weeks. The hushed phone calls, his evasiveness about finances, the temporary apartment that had become home for 3 months. I had let it go, a choice I was now beginning to curse. "The debts," I stated plainly. "Has it gotten worse?" "I'm dealing with it," he replied. But the words were clipped, guarded. Not his usual response. His gaze faltered for a moment before meeting mine again. I held his eyes. "Lorenzo, tell me what's going on." "It's nothing for you to bear." His tone was hard, a stark contrast to his normal, easy manner. "But you need to be safe, all right? Be aware of your surroundings, in the car, with people. Just be aware." "You're frightening me." "I'm being cautious." He gave me a look I recognized, one reserved for only the gravest of situations. "Promise me you'll be vigilant." I promised, Clear's throat, not fully grasping the reason, but knowing he never made such requests lightly. His voice left no space for doubt. This was deadly serious. I wouldn't understand until much later, when the jagged fragments of truth finally aligned that he was already drowning. He had received the menacing demands, the impossible figures, and then a picture of me, captured from afar, leaving work. Beneath it, the chilling caption, "We know what she means to you both." He never told me. He bore that weight alone, as he always did, believing he could contain the storm before it broke over me. My doctor's visit was standard. The car waiting outside the clinic was a perfect replica of Dante's. Same model, same shade, with the very license plate I had committed to memory. A detail like that isn't coincidence. It's born from meticulous design, from an insider feeding them exact details. It requires time, money, and flawless execution. The driver's wave seemed casual as I neared. He opened the door, pronouncing my name with perfect inflection. I slipped inside. But once seated, I knew the scent was wrong. Not the familiar leather, nor the distinct air freshener Dante's man favored. The seat's upholstery felt subtly off, a detail lost on anyone else. But I knew that car. My lips parted to speak, but the moment was gone. It was swift, clinical, executed with the chilling logic that precision goes unnoticed while chaos invites scrutiny. They stole the one advantage Dante always commanded, the time to react. Consciousness returned to me, bound to a chair. The room was small, the air thick. A low, synthetic light offered no clue to the hour. My hands were secured behind me, the knots tied with an expert's hand, a clear message of skill. In the face of ruin, I fell back on instinct. I counted. 3 men in sight, more pacing beyond the door. I traced the layout through the acoustics of the walls. No windows. A single door locked from without. The place was climate-controlled, professional, not makeshift. And then my thoughts turned to the child. I felt its presence within me, the only part of this space that belonged to me, and I clung to that truth, holding it like a last breath before the plunge. One slow breath, then another. I used the familiar method I'd perfected over a lifetime of solitary burdens. It worked as it always did. Flawed, but enough. My mind went to Dante, not with the foolish hope of a damsel in distress, but with the cold assurance of one who understands a man's nature so completely she can predict his every move. This baby is mine. A man who speaks those words in that tone does not abandon his own. This wasn't hope, it was strategy. And Clear's throat, it granted me the stillness I needed. At 2 p.m, Lorenzo's phone lit up with the second picture. It showed me in the chair, wrists tied, but alive. Unharmed, yet undeniably a prisoner. Beneath the photo, a single chilling command. "You know who has our price. Go to him. Now. We see everything." And Lorenzo ran. He tore across the city, the phone clutched in his hand, the image burning on its screen. He burst into Viscari Holdings, his breath ragged, the gasp of a man whose burdens had finally crushed him. Marco met his gaze, saw the raw desperation. and led him upstairs without a word. Dante was by the window as Lorenzo stumbled in. He turned, and the anguish of the brother's face made his posture tighten in a way Marco had almost never witnessed. "Speak," Dante ordered, and the story spilled out. He told him everything about the threats, the demands, the debt that had spiraled out of his hands, and the crushing discovery that his lenders answered to Victor Srokin. He confessed about the first photo of Alicia, the one he had hidden for weeks, foolishly believing he could fix it all himself. And then he spoke of today's image. "I never thought they would use her," Lorenzo choked out, his voice finally breaking. "I swear I never saw this coming." Dante said nothing. Lorenzo would later call that silence the most crushing weight he had ever known. It wasn't fury, it was far more terrifying. It was the absolute control of a man suppressing an emotional torrent, a stillness that cost him everything to maintain. Then the phone on the desk began to ring. The number was blocked. Dante lifted the receiver before it could ring twice. Clear's throat, his motion fluid. Certain. He knew who it was. On the line, a voice steeped in a cold, manufactured calm, the kind of composure wielded as a weapon. "Dante Viscari." A deliberate pause. "I trust you're aware of the girl's location." Dante remained quiet. The silence was his confession. Lorenzo Romano proved to be the perfect tool. Victor stated, his tone flat with the satisfaction of a plan unfolding perfectly. "His debt was our key, his sister our leverage, and you." Another pause. "You were our motive." Dante angled his head toward the glass, his jaw a line of granite. "The terms are straightforward," Victor went on. "You sign over the territory we want. You cede the access. You absorb all of Romano's debt. Do this, and you get her back." The proposition was unthinkable, not because of the money, but because of what it meant. A permanent shift in power between their empires. It was a surrender Dante would never make, no matter the pressure, no matter the threat. With a single exception. "You have 2 hours," Victor warned. "After that, the price goes up, and I make no promises about her condition, or the child's." The call ended. The quiet that filled the office was unlike anything Marco had ever felt in all his years with Dante. It was not rage. It was the precursor to it. Something deeper, more lethal. It was the silent detonation inside a man who had dedicated his life to protecting his own, now confronting the specter of being too late. Lorenzo stood, ashen-faced, his eyes reflecting the true, catastrophic scale of his mistake. "Dante," he whispered, his voice shattered. "I never knew." "I know," Dante replied, his tone low and sharp, yet devoid of malice. He was already on his feet, already in motion, his choice made in the instant Victor assumed he had 2 hours to spare. Marco would later describe the events of the next 2 hours with the clipped brevity of a man unwilling to revisit a memory. Dante signed no papers. He ceded no ground. He made 3 calls to names Marco never uttered, and I never questioned. Within 40 minutes, he had the warehouse address, a head count of the men inside, and confirmation Victor was acting alone, without his organization's support. It was a gamble made with stolen power, and Dante, a man whose life's work was separating feints from fatal threats, unraveled the entire scheme. Before Victor even knew his 2-hour ultimatum was pure fiction. I only learned what transpired at the warehouse in pieces. There was no gunfire. Dante's teams breached from 3 points simultaneously. I learned that Victor took a call mid-operation from a superior, and whatever he heard was enough to make him vanish. moments before Dante arrived. Everything after that was quiet. An abrupt hush fell over the warehouse. It was the sudden absence of the ambient sound I'd grown used to since waking, the shuffle of feet, indistinct whispers, the groan of a nearby chair that registered first. It was as if the world's volume had been cut. The quiet that followed was not the quiet of emptiness, but the charged stillness of a place hastily abandoned, a distinction anyone could feel in their bones. Something had shifted outside, for better or worse, I couldn't know, and that uncertainty was a poison. I remained motionless, slowing my breath, focusing my entire being on the small life beneath my heart. That silent, precious weight had been my only anchor for hours, and I held to it, waiting with the resolve of a woman who has no other choice but to endure. The seconds bled into minutes, each one stretching into an eternity, until the door finally swung open. Dante appeared first, a solitary figure in a dark suit, his shoulders squared. I knew his gait like my own heartbeat, but this time it held a new resonance. It was swift, but not a run. It was the measured, purposeful stride of a man who had already mapped this path in his mind, executing a flawless, predetermined plan. In less than 2 seconds, his gaze devoured the room before it found me, and there it locked. Relief wasn't the first thing I felt. It was something more profound, more primal, the flicker in the eyes of a man who had braced himself for hell and was now recalibrating the distance between that nightmare and what was real. Me, alive. Me, intact. My hand resting on my stomach, my gaze unwavering, even with my wrists bound to a chair, because Elijah Romano does not look away. He crossed to me without a word and lowered himself to one knee. That singular act, Dante Biscari kneeling, landed with an unexpected gravity that shattered my composure before I could defend against it. His hands moved to the ropes on my wrists, sheer and deft, and the knot surrendered in an instant. As the ropes fell away, my hands were immediately enveloped by his. He wasn't squeezing, just covering them, a warmth so profound it felt like something I'd been desperate for without even knowing it. His eyes conducted a systematic sweep of my body, a clinical, urgent search for injuries born from hours spent imagining the worst. He was still cataloging horrors that hadn't happened. "You're okay," he breathed. The words as much for himself as for me, a confirmation spoken aloud to make it real. "I am," I replied. His hand cupped my face, his thumb tracing my cheek, his eyes finding mine. And in their depths, I saw a vulnerability that had never existed in any version of him I had ever known. This wasn't the boss, nor the detached man from Milan. It wasn't the fortress he had meticulously built around himself, a wall that had already begun to crumble. This was the man underneath it all, stripped of every artifice, laid bare by the relentless ticking of the past few hours, which had made pretending an impossibility. The moment lasted only a heartbeat. He rose, his hands firmly on my waist as he helped me to my feet. Standing before him, he paused, his gaze drinking me in, as if needing the extra second to truly believe I was whole. In the car, a heavy silence settled for 2 long minutes as I stared out the window. He kept his eyes on the road, but the tension was still etched in the hard line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, and the rigid way his hands gripped his knee, the last remnants of the battle he had been fighting. "You were afraid," he stated. "Yes." "Of what?" I turned to face him then. He didn't look back, but the question was taut with the need for an honest answer. I could have offered him any number of truths, the dank warehouse, the suffocating uncertainty. Any of them would have been easier, safer than the one I chose. "Of never seeing you again," I confessed. The silence that followed was entirely different from the ones before. A muscle flexed in his jaw. The hand that had been resting on his knee moved slowly, deliberately, and found mine in the space between us. It simply stayed there. He didn't release my hand for the entire drive back to his apartment, and neither of us spoke of it. It was one of those fragile things that thrived best in the quiet. Dante and I had learned the hard way that words can sometimes diminish what is most essential. That unspoken conversation became not just a memory, but a cornerstone. The words I'd spoken, with a voice raw with terrifying truth, his ensuing silence, and his hand that refused to let go of mine, they were foundational bricks. We had no blueprint for what we were building, but we both knew the work had begun. 3 weeks after my rescue, I found myself living in his apartment. It was never a spoken decision, but a slow erosion of the defenses I had held for so long, a process hastened by the kidnapping, by the words in the car, and by one particular afternoon when I came home to my own space, reflexively reached for my phone to call him, and felt the acute ache of his absence in a room that was only mine. I never told him that. I just arrived with a single suitcase, and he, in turn, never mentioned its modest size. It was our way. But a language without words has its breaking point, and we found ours in the second week. I woke at 3 a.m. to find his side of the bed empty. I found him by the living room window, phone in hand, wearing the same closed-off expression of the man I first met. He was inaccessible, operating on a frequency I couldn't reach. When I asked what was wrong, his reply was a clipped, "Work." It was the same tone he'd used before Milan, a clear signal that the door was shut. I returned to our room and lay awake until dawn, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. The breaking point was an argument over Lorenzo's treatment, sparked when I found the bank statement. I confronted him not with fury over the help itself, but over the secrecy. Hiding things was the very poison that had torn us apart before, and if he was just repeating the same pattern in a new context, I had to know now. "I paid because it had to be done," he said, his voice flat. "You hid it because that's what you do," I shot back. The silence that fell was the old suffocating kind I refused to live in again. After a long moment, he finally spoke, the difficulty visible in his jaw before I heard it in his voice. "I don't know how to be different yet," he admitted, "but I'm trying. It was a small offering, but it was honest." And I was coming to understand that with Dante, honesty was the only ground from which anything could grow. Lorenzo was in a clinic for men who'd drowned in gambling debts, a place that provided the structure he needed to break the cycle. He had gone by his own choice for the first time in his life, a fact I was still trying to reconcile weeks later. Lorenzo had always been the fixer, the one who carried everyone's burdens behind an easy smile and hugs that held on just a little too long. This new version of him, the one who had finally admitted he needed help, was someone I was learning to see through a haze of both relief and pain. The kind that comes when you know help only arrived because the alternative was unthinkable. I visited him every Tuesday, a quiet, consistent presence, because I knew my brother needed the rhythm of reliability more than grand gestures. Dante was paying for everything. I found out purely by chance a statement in the wrong file bearing the clinic's name and his unmistakable signature. I stared at the paper, a warmth stirring inside me that I refused to name. To give it a name would be to accept its meaning, and I was not yet brave enough for that conclusion. I said nothing. He said nothing. It was our language. things communicated without being spoken, which sometimes felt lacking and sometimes was more than enough. One Wednesday night, he came home to find me on the balcony. The city sprawled beneath us, buildings etched in gold against the twilight sky. I was turned toward the view, my hands on the railing, the soft curve of my pregnancy now visible. A stillness had settled over the evening, a kind of quiet I had almost forgotten was possible. I heard the door, his footsteps, a sound I now knew intimately in all its variations. I recognized the specific cadence he used when he looked for me before anything else. He stopped at the entrance to the balcony, just watching me for a moment, and in his distant gaze, I saw something I could feel, but not yet understand. It was the look of a man discovering a sight he hadn't anticipated, pausing for a beat to simply absorb it. He approached, standing beside me so close our arms nearly brushed. For the first time in ages, the quiet between us was a comfort. It wasn't the heavy silence of words left unsaid, but the easy stillness of two souls sharing a space, needing no sound to fill it. "Lorenzo called," I mentioned. "I know. He said he came to you before it all happened." A moment passed, the city murmuring far below. "Said you were angry," I ventured. I was, but he was right. Dante turned to face me then, and in his gaze was a vulnerability I had never witnessed in him before. This wasn't the boss, the charmer, or the suited figure who commanded respect in silence. This was the man a brave, infuriating brother had forced to face his own reflection, a man still processing that image weeks later. "He has a terrible way of saying the right things," Dante remarked. A small, unbidden laugh escaped me, the kind that happens before you can stop it. He watched me with a look I knew well, the look of someone filing away a moment, a thought not yet ready for words. The quiet that followed was not uncomfortable. It was a destination. "I was an idiot," he stated, blunt and without the usual defenses people build around costly confessions. "With you." Following that night in Milan, I understood my feelings, and I hid behind a wall because it was simpler than facing the aftermath. "It wasn't," I murmured. "It wasn't," he conceded. "You never said a word." "I know." His gaze remained steady. "I allowed you to believe you were just another conquest, because what I felt scared me more than anything before, and I had no words for it, so I did the only thing I know how, when words fail me." "You built a wall," I finished. "I built a wall," he admitted, unguarded and direct. It was the honesty he reserved for when it mattered most. "That can't undo the past months," I told him. "No," he acknowledged. "But it is the truth, and you deserve that above all." He retrieved something from his pocket. It was unassuming, not the sort of object that demands attention. It was a plain, dark gold band that possessed the quiet weight of history. I would later learn it mirrored his mother's ring, his sole point of reference for this gesture, and that he'd agonized over its selection more than any choice in the last year. He held it, but he didn't kneel. That wasn't him, and I wouldn't want it to be. A kneeling Dante wouldn't feel real, and this moment had to be real. "I don't know how to do this," he confessed, his voice hushed with a quality unique to this one person, in this one instant that could never be replicated. "I don't know how to be with someone without making it about control. I don't know a way to love that doesn't frighten them, and frighten me." I stayed silent as he went on, but I did learn something. His gaze locked with mine, carrying that unwavering intensity I had come to see as his truest self. "The only time I've ever been truly afraid was when you were missing." I held my breath, not knowing if I would make it in time. You counted, I whispered. Everyone. The realization settled, not like a blow, but like a rising tide, the way profound truths arrive, unhurried and absolute. Dante Viscari, a man whose existence was founded on control, distance, and never needing anyone enough to be exposed, had been counting every minute. He didn't put the ring on my finger, but into my open palm with the deliberate, meaningful motion. It was the distinction between a command and a request, between choosing for me and letting me choose. Stay, he urged, not for my child, not on my orders, because I am asking you. You despise asking, I pointed out. I do, he admitted, his candor almost comical. This is as close as you get to proposing, isn't it? For now, he replied, a new kind of humor in his tone, one that had emerged as his defenses crumbled, unlike any levity I'd witnessed from him before. I suppose you could improve with practice. I laughed, a genuine, unburdened sound that comes only with the right person at the right time. He watched me with that same look from the Milan bistro, a look I could finally identify. It was the face of a man realizing he wanted to see that very thing for the rest of his days. I slipped the ring onto my finger. You'll need a great deal of practice, I told him. His hand moved to my stomach, slow and deliberate, with the tenderness that was still foreign to him, a price he was willing to pay. His hand rested there, a warm, solid presence over the place our child grew, blissfully unaware of the tangled emotions of its parents. We have time, he said. We have time. My brother's warnings from day one echoed in my mind. Dangerous, a philanderer, uncontrollable. He was correct on all counts. He was mistaken about only one detail. He believed it would drive me away. Instead, it was precisely why I remained. I hadn't realized that in choosing him, I was also inviting in everything that was yet to come. This is Lena. That concludes Book 1, and my work on Book 2 is already complete. Access is available for a very modest fee. The envelope had no sending address. Assuming it was business, I tore it open, expecting another contract to sign. But inside were dates, files, messages I'd never laid eyes on, and a final handwritten sentence. The script was unfamiliar, but it held the chilling serenity of someone fully aware of the destruction they are causing. He didn't just know about your brother's debts. He redirected them, pushed Lorenzo onto the path that led to you being taken. Ask him why. The page slipped from my fingers. I stared at the ring, at my stomach, at the door behind which Dante worked, oblivious that I held the evidence that the man who begged me to stay had also orchestrated the entire peril. Dante's rescue wasn't a rescue at all. He had pulled me from a snare of his own making, and for the first time since accepting his proposal, I questioned whether I belonged there. As you can imagine, this is merely a glimpse into Book 2. For the complete, uncensored version, simply select the first link in the pinned comment. I will meet you there momentarily. As a reminder, that initial link in the comments will take you directly to the full, ad-free, and uninterrupted second book. It is just that easy. I'm having a wonderful time creating Book 2. And because of your incredible response, I can assure you there will be more. Here you will discover narratives that venture into much deeper, steamier territory. This is true. Dark romance. Because this content is significantly more intense, it is not suited for a public YouTube release. This exclusive area allows me to reveal my authentic creative spirit and produce my finest work for you. Please remember, the channel is no longer monetized. This initiative is what allows me to support my team and to continue delivering these high-caliber narratives. More updates will be shared shortly. I'll be expecting you via that first link in the pinned comment. Regrettably, there have been numerous instances of individuals downloading our audio, copying the story in its entirety, and re-uploading it to YouTube.
Life lesson. Ignoring a warning does not cancel the danger, it only delays the explosion. He thought she was just stepping into a better job, bigger salary, better office, cleaner future. She thought discipline would protect her, professionalism would shield her, and common sense would keep her heart locked down. Big mistake. Because life loves one kind of plot twist more than anything else, the one people were warned about, laughed at, and then walked straight into anyway. That is what makes this lesson hit so hard. The danger was never hidden. It was named early. Her brother saw it. The room saw it. Even the silence around that man screamed trouble. But she believed self-control was enough. She believed bad things only happen to reckless people, to careless people, to people who do not see the signs. Yet life does not always punish blindness. Sometimes it punishes confidence. And that is the first brutal truth. People do not fall because they know nothing. They fall because they think they know enough. He was powerful, cold, unreadable. She was smart, composed, and certain she could keep boundaries clean. Then the smallest details started doing damage. A coffee prepared exactly how she liked it. A pause that lasted 1 second too long. A touch that looked accidental but was anything but accidental. That is how real danger often works. Not like a gunshot, like a drip, like a slow poison, like something entering quietly until it owns the whole bloodstream. The life lesson here is not never trust. It is sharper than that. When someone or something keeps bending your emotional gravity, stop pretending you are unaffected just because you are still standing. A person can be fully dressed, on time, productive, and still already losing the war inside. And then comes the second twist. The real wound was not just attraction, it was silence. After intimacy, after closeness, after one night that changed everything, he turned cold. That is where the deeper lesson lands. Many people can cause damage without shouting, without insulting, without officially leaving. Sometimes emotional abandonment wears a suit and shows up to work on time. So what should the viewer take from all this? Simple. Warnings are not cages, they are gifts. The person who loves someone enough to say, "Good, I'll pay attention," is not always being dramatic. Sometimes they are the only one hearing the fuse burn.